here at ABC and throughout the human service world, and certainly our network, we are indeed trauma informed. And we're going to touch on some issues today that could be triggering for some folks. And we want to let folks know that ahead of time, so that you are aware. And I'm getting ready to introduce our keynote speaker, Joe Roberts, in a quick second here. Um, I think that you will be inspired. Um, Joe certainly inspired me several months ago when I saw him, uh, our state association, the New York State Association of Community Action Agencies. We had our conference in Lake Placid, and he was the keynote. And before he left the stage, I messaged him and I said, no, we need to have that kind of energy for the ABC conference. So Joe Roberts, the Skid Row CEO, has an honorary doctorate from Laurentian University, and he's the winner of the Courage to Come Back Award and was recently awarded the Meritorious Service Medal from the Governor General of Canada. Yes, he's Canadian. Joe's life, however, wasn't always this good. In fact, 25 years ago, he actually pushed a shopping cart in Vancouver's notorious downtown east side, experiencing homelessness and addiction. That's why his nickname is the Skid Row CEO. Joe's story is one of perseverance, determination, and the resiliency of the human spirit. He's a living testament to the idea that anything is possible. Please help me give a virtual welcome to Joe Roberts, our keynote speaker from today. And before Joe starts, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to turn the chat off so that we can really focus on what Joe is saying. However, please utilize the Q&A function because we're going to leave some time for Joe to answer some questions that you may have. But again, good morning, Joe. Welcome to ABC Signature Conference.
Jerome, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's so good to be here today. I'm really excited. I have to tell you something funny. Back in the fall of last year, I had to speak to a large engineering firm in Ontario. And as I'm sitting at the side stage, they're about to introduce me, and they read a variation of the bio that you just read. Very kind, thank you. And I'm sitting there thinking, what does a guy who lived under bridges and tunnels for 10 years of his life say to people who build bridges and tunnels for a living? And the best thing I could come up with was thanks. Keep up the good work. And I say that because today is an extraordinary fit for the message. The bio sounds like I pulled my socks up and got on with it. And aren't I a great guy? But nothing could be further from the truth. I'm here today because of over 10,000 people who fought for me, who gave me a voice, who supported me when I was really vulnerable, because I was that guy out there struggling. And had I not had that opportunity, I really wouldn't be here sharing these ideas and this. So another little story, and then I'll get into things. So I do have a dark sense of humor, and sometimes it gets me into trouble. I don't know about you, but when I was little, I used humor as a way to deflect when I feel uncomfortable, but oftentimes it comes out at the weirdest places. I had to speak a couple of years ago to the Ontario Provincial Police at the commissioners event. So there was like, the Ontario police are like your state troopers. And so we had about 1,000 cops in the room, all the senior leadership from the entire province of Ontario, which is Canada's largest province. And I'm at the head table, and beside me was the commissioner of the OPP, and the other side is the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. And the waiter asked me if I'd like a drink. And I'm a person of long-term recovery, so considering that I was in a room with 1,000 people, that would not be the best night for me to start drinking again. So instead of saying no, thank you, and that would have been the end of it, I said I can't. And I remember the waiter looked at me and he says, "You can't. Why can't you?" And now I've either got to tell this person my life story or a little white lie to get out of it. And so I chose a little white lie, and I said, "Well, I can't because I'm allergic." And the waiter says, "Well, you're allergic. What kind of reaction do you have when you drink?" And I said, "I break out in handcuffs." And I remember looking at the commissioner, and he thought it was the funniest thing he'd heard. But the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario either didn't get the joke or didn't find me amusing. But that's my story. I'm sticking to it. I always open with a couple of dumb dad jokes, some self-deprecating humor, because the world that we live in today, I think more than ever, needs us for us to find, to find the levity and to find ways that we can balance some of the tough stuff that's going on. I know, Jerome, you mentioned the trigger warning. Before I get going, I do want to say that I'm going to share pieces of my life story, and there's parts of it that are hard, but in that truth, I think that there's some healing and that there's a way forward. And I say that because I will talk about homelessness, I will talk about domestic violence, I will talk about mental health and suicide ideation, because they're parts of my story. And so I want to, the last thing I ever want to do when I address a group is to have you leave in a worse way. And so if these things come up for you, if stuff comes up for you, if you need to pause, I completely understand. And use the tools and people that you have in your mental health support toolkit, right? And when I was 22 years old, this was actually a picture of me. And so one of the things that I love about humor is it's a real powerful way for us to shift the way we're looking at the world, the way we're looking at ourselves, the way we're looking at potential and possibility. For a number of years, I struggled. I was that person who needed access to resources. I was a guy who pushed a shopping cart and lived under the Georgia Street Viaduct. By the time I was 22 years old, I was chronically, struggling with substance use disorder, mental health, unemployability. In me was a possibility and potential, but I couldn't access it on my own. And that's why I give credit where it's due. I mean, on this call today, I can see we've got 109 people. I can't help but think of how many 109 people actually connect out into the community over the course of your careers and your time and all the various different work that you do. We're talking hundreds of thousands of interactions and people. I'm here today because somebody held a space for me. They saw potential, they invested in me. Now, I would hope and pray that nobody ever experiences what you can see on that screen. But in many ways, the world that we live in today has those challenges, and those challenges impact the way we do business. You got challenges at a political level, at a municipal, state, federal level. We've got mindsets, we've got public perception, you've got social media, and then you've got all these other things going on in the world. We've got all these big challenges happening in fires in California. The healing that needs to happen in New Orleans, and if that stuff isn't enough, we've got all these other big things going on in the macro world. We've got a war in Ukraine and unrest and financial uncertainty. What is the next couple of years going to look like? And so you may never push a shopping cart and live under a bridge, but in many ways, the experience is similar. Because a day in the life for me looked like dealing with a lot of stress. I mean, people ask me, say, "Joe, what was it like, being there?" And I can tell you about being cold, and I can tell you about being hungry. But I think that one of the biggest things for me is that I didn't have access to the stuff I needed to move my life forward. I had trouble and knots in the rope and trauma and different things that I needed to work through. Every night I would go to bed or camp out wherever I was, and I had a head full of problems that didn't have solutions. And I had to wake up the next morning and somehow try to move things forward. And I didn't always make the right choices. So you may never be, in this situation, but I think a lot of what the world has offered us in the last few years has really pushed in and challenged us on what's possible, right? And I believe that possibility is the way forward. You know, Denise, you talked about hope is a decision, but hope is a decision that's hard to make when we actually can't see it. And for years in my life, I couldn't see my possibility. But I believe it is the way forward. I believe that we live in a very exciting time in history, right? Where, you know, we're going to look back at this in the not too distant future and call it before. But how do we get to the place where we can see solutions? Because I think one of the biggest things is you get really well-intentioned people, and there's, you know, all of you on this call are in this work because you've got a passion for it, but it's so easy to get our optimism mugged from us, yeah, in the kind of environment. And so what happens is, and there's a whole bunch of brain science behind this, we get to this place where we want to move here, we want to do these things, but it becomes difficult for us to see the way through to possibility because we see, in a very natural sense, we see the world through a probability lens. Probability is looking at ourselves in the future and assessing it based on the talent I have right now, past experience, and the likelihood of success. And we do this every single day, right? Every single decision, every single moment. We do that because it's part of our survival mechanism. Because we don't want to really put time and energy into something that's going to be a failure, whether that's hunting for food or creating social change, right? So probability, when we are under threat and when there's a lot going on, becomes sort of the default way we see the world, the way we see ourselves, and the way we see the future. Possibility is the other side of that. Possibility is this really exciting, extraordinary way of looking at things. Impossibility is hope. Impossibility is transformation. Impossibility is the ability to transition, to empower communities and inspire change. You see, in the essence of possibility is all innovation and change. 200 years ago, we didn't have electricity in our homes, and now we can fly to outer space with Richard Branson if you had enough money, right? And so when you look at all of the different evidence around us of possibility, it's around you right now in this moment. It's the cell phone that was the possibility of Apple and Steve Jobs, the vehicle that you drive, which was the possibility of Henry Ford, right? So possibility is the thing that inspires us behind all great change and social warriors. It's the thing that we admire in Gandhi. It's the thing that we admire in Nelson Mandela. It's the thing that we admire in Dr. King. And oftentimes, great social warriors, they create a possibility for us to move towards, and they don't achieve it in their lifetime. In fact, I've watched so many times that address, the "I Have a Dream." You know, it's this possibility that we move towards that really drives and pulls us forward as a species. And I think it's the highest expression that human beings can aspire for, right? Possibility is the thing that we admire in underdog teams. It's the thing that we admire in great coaches. And possibility is how I got to who I am, back there to who I am today. You know, in fact, every single one of us in this call is here today because people invested in us. Sometimes it's mom and dad. Sometimes it isn't. It's a teacher. It's a coach. It's a pastor, right? Possibility is the feeling I had when my daughter was born and I held her in my arms, in front of her with a blank pages that would be her life. The thing is that possibility never goes away for any of us at any moment in time. Right? Starting now, our future is absolutely spotless. Right? And so I want to challenge each and every one of you right now to think about a possibility that you're working on. Now, this could be a possibility for your wellness, for your health, for your family. It'd be good if you could think about something professional, a goal you're working on in 2025. You know, we're starting the year off, and in front of us are almost 12 months. What big possibility are you working on? What policy are you pushing through? What person are you rooting for? think about something medium to large that you're working on, because before I'm done, I want to I want to pave the way and give you some, not just some inspiration, but some application, some tools and ideas that will help you move that forward. So I want you to sort of marinate on a big possibility that you're working on. And we're going to come back and unpack some ideas. Now, if you would have had this conversation about possibility with me, back when I was struggling, I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it in myself. I had a whole bunch of years of failure. I didn't think very much of myself. So, it was hard for me to see anything past my day-to-day struggle. It's when you're unhoused and you're hungry and you're struggling and you're caught in a vicious cycle of substance use disorder. I couldn't see myself going to school. I couldn't see myself. I really believed that where I had ended up was where it was gonna finish off for me. But I got that second chance. Now, I think what's really, really important, especially when we look at poverty and we look at the trajectory on what we can do to battle and to get in front of some of these issues, is to understand what happened before this happened and go upstream. Because I actually didn't come from a bad place. I grew up in a little town north of Toronto, Ontario, in a little place called Midland. And I remember my early days as a kid were pretty good. I grew up we didn't have a lot of money growing up, but I wouldn't say we were poor. We just didn't, we weren't really trying to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. My dad worked at the local seatbelt factory. He was a blue collar man. We were a blue collar family. Mom was a homemaker, and I went to Monsignor Castic second elementary school, and that's me in grade 2, Mrs. Morrison's class. And for the first 8 years of my life, things were awesome. But I have to tell you something: if you would have sat beside me in class, you wouldn't have got good grades. And that's because I didn't know it, and nobody knew this at the time. In the early 70s, I had mild dyslexia and ADHD, and so my reading comprehension and paying attention in class was challenging. And so I didn't do well in school. I made my living as a class clown. And my favorite class was recess. What I couldn't wait for is at 3:30 the bell rang and I got to run home and be with this extraordinary family. I had this larger than life dad, a stay-at-home mom, an older brother, a younger sister, a little dog named Angus. And for the first 8 years, things in my life were perfect. Couldn't have been more ideal. My dad was a kind of guy who used to say things to me like, I love you, son. You can do and be anything. My father spoke to my possibility as a kid. And he held that space for me. My dad was a deeply invested parent. He loved, camping with us and playing baseball, and he couldn't wait to get home from the factory to hang out with us kids. Unfortunately, when my dad was only 35 years old, he had a major heart attack, and he passed away suddenly. And so what happened overnight was the trajectory of our family changed. We were walking down the road of life, minding our own business, and life left us. Nobody in our family signed up for that. And the unfortunate part was that my father was very poorly insured. And so my mom had no safety net whatsoever. We weren't the kind of family that had savings, And so we immediately plunged down sort of that, fell way below the poverty line. My mom didn't even have a job. And so here she is now tasked with having to raise these 3 kids, ages 5, 8, and 11, on her own with no income. And my mom was a proud woman, and she did the best she could, and she got help from her dad, my grandpa. But what happened was, within a short period of time, my mom remarried. and I don't fault her for this because she was in a tough spot. But she made a decision based on, I believe, economics. And unfortunately, the fellow who came into my life next, my stepfather, wasn't anything like my dad. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. And so I went from you know, a dad who would say things like, I love you, you can do and be anything, to this male figure who would say things like, you're stupid, you're dumb, and you'll never amount to anything. And I was 8 years old, and I didn't know how to process that. And the thing that I understand today is that if you can get a kid to believe a lie about who they are, you can predict some of their poor choices. And so, at a very young age, like before I was 10 years old, I started to have trouble with my mental health. We didn't have words for it back then. We didn't have language. We didn't talk, to people about what was going on at home. And so we, as a family, we sort of struggled in silence. And so before I was 10 years old, I had two underlying traumas. I had the grief that was unresolved from losing my father, and I had the ongoing verbal, physical, and mental and emotional abuse from my stepdad. And so when the opportunity presented itself at 9 years old to use drugs, I did it. My brother and his older friends were experimenting, and they asked me to join, and I joined. And I've shared this message with over 1 million young people over the years. I didn't do it because of peer pressure. I did it because of self-pressure. I wanted so bad to belong. Johann Hari, in his book Chasing the Scream, he says the opposite of addiction isn't recovery, it's community. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's like, for me, my road to health it has all been about community. And when my brother and his older friends invited me to use drugs with them, I joined because of community. I wanted to fit. I was desperate to have, some kind of connection. I so understand the attractiveness of gang life, because if I was born in a community that had that kind of thing going on, I wasn't, but I would have been an easy candidate to recruit, because having that family, having that connection, having having your people like that, to me, was everything. And so what happened is I used drugs for the first time, and then I went home, and under the influence, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. And my stepfather came in the house that night all angry and and intimidating, and it was kind of his way. And for the first time, I remember just looking at him and smiling. I wasn't scared. And so that began a 15-year trajectory that took me to some of the darkest places that you can go in our Western world. Right? I just kind of want to pause for a second. Human beings, when we face uncertainty and fear, look for ways to alter our emotional state. During COVID, I saw a real uptick in different ways that people were trying to escape, some social media, some isolation, some, with streaming videos, some with food, some with alcohol, some with recreational drugs. When we feel uncertain, it's a natural thing for us to look for a way to feel different and better. I don't know what your go-to is. If you've got a healthy toolbox, maybe you exercise and meditate, and you've got a group or a friend that you talk to. But not everybody has those things. And so I found a way to cope, and that became a pattern that I ran to for the next 15 years. By the time I was 15, I was getting in all kinds of trouble. At 15 years old, I got kicked out of school. At 15, I got kicked out of the house. At 16, I got kicked out of school. And at 17, I got arrested for the first time. Now, I was never a big danger to law enforcement or the community. It was more of a danger to myself. But I began down that road, and I didn't seem to be able to put on the brakes. And at this point in my life, I was in grade 10, and I was dating this gal, and she was the very first serious relationship that I had. And she was she meant the world to me because she was my first love, my first serious relationship, and she was someone who believed in me. And 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 the other thing that was interesting about this relationship is that she was the first person who I let in. You know what I mean? Like the first person who I actually took the mask off and showed who I really was and got vulnerable. But because my life was careening out of control, um, she sat me down and said, Joe, I'm not going where you're going. I want a family. I want to go to college. You know, I want to have a career, and this is where we part. And I remember feeling devastated. And I decided that was it. I was going to leave Ontario. I was living in just north of Toronto. I decided I was going to go to Vancouver, and I went to Toronto. I got on a bus. 3 days later, I landed in Vancouver. And I remember I was in this little park, and it was a beautiful sunny morning in May. Um, the Expo 86 was going on in Vancouver, the World's Fair. And I remember I got off the bus and I went to this park and the sun was coming up and I had this overwhelming feeling of aspiration, you know, like this is the place where I'm going to get a mulligan, get a do-over. And, you know, little did I know that park in that moment and that aspiration that just a few weeks later, I'd be sleeping in that park. You see, I made that poor decision that so many young people make that if I move to the city, it's going to be different. And what happened was I was a small town kid who landed in a city that was full of all kinds of danger and predation. And so what happened was predictable. Over the next few years, my life just sort of slid out of control until I was, you know, that guy pushing the shopping cart, collecting cans and bottles to support my drug dependency. And every morning I would wake up thinking today is going to be different, and it wasn't. And I didn't have the tools to break the cycle on my own. You know, I knew that there was more to life in me, but I just couldn't open that door on my own. 3 days before Christmas, 1989, I had one of the worst days of my life. I was going through withdrawal from opiates, and I don't want to get into too much detail, because yeah, there may be people with lived experience on the call. But I was sitting on a park bench. For those of you who don't understand opiate withdrawal, I'll just give you this context. It's like the worst flu you've ever had in your life times 1,000. So if you've ever been sick, you know you get the flu symptoms: weak, dry mouth, upset stomach, pounding headache, and you know, think about the last time you had the flu. Now think about having that on a park bench in the pouring rain. I was sitting on that bench, rocking back and forth, thinking, where am I going to get $10 just to make myself feel better? And I didn't want to rob or steal because I was never a violent guy. And I looked down at my boots, came up with a good idea. And when the bar opened across the street, I walked in. And 10 minutes later, I came out without those boots. I had sold the only item I had left in the world that was worth anything. And I remember that feeling of hopelessness and despair as I walked up the street. And, you know, honestly, I was so tired and broken. I didn't want to be here anymore. And in that moment, I did something different and I reached up for help and I said a little prayer. And it went something like, you know, God, give me a second chance. I don't deserve it, but I'd love a second chance. And if you give it to me, I promise I won't waste the opportunity. The next day, I walked into a frontline resource center and met probably some people just like you. And they connected me with my mom, and my mom gave me another chance. I went back to Ontario, actually in a little town called Belleville, which is right across the lake from Rochester. In fact, if you go down to the harbor and look out at Lake Ontario, there's right across from you is a little place called Prince Edward County, and then behind that is Belleville. And so I went to this treatment center, and my life began to turn around. You know, 3 weeks before that happened, I met a guy on a park bench who would forever change the way I see people, myself, and the world around us. And it's probably the most important leadership discussion I ever had with somebody in my life. And it was only 8 minutes long. You see, before I'd sold my boots, a couple of weeks earlier, I was sitting on a park bench beside this guy. His name was Gus. And I remember he looked at me and he said, Joe, he says, you're a remarkable young man. He says, if you were able to deal with your addiction and your homelessness, you could do something extraordinary with your life. He said, Joe, he says, there's more to you than you could see. In that moment, I had dirty black fingernails, scruffy beard, broken yellow teeth, hair that hadn't been combed, clothes I'd been wearing for over a year, and horrendous personal hygiene. For the first time in my life, someone other than my mom or my daddy spoke to what was just behind how I was showing up in life. He spoke to my possibility. And Gus was right. Back in Ontario, I was in this treatment center and I had this social worker, this lying, sneaking, conniving social worker trick me into going back to college. And I say he tricked me because I had a self-belief problem. I didn't think I was a smart kid. Why would a dumb kid go to college? But after 6 months of treatment, he coerced me into going back to community college. And I did so reluctantly. And I went onto the campus at Loyalist, and I didn't think that was my place. But I put my head down and I did the work. And something remarkable happened. I started to get A's, I started to get B's. Finally, after 3.5 years, I walked across the stage at Loyalist College. They called out my name. They said, Joe Roberts, Dean's List. I graduated with a 3.94 GPA. I still didn't get a haircut, though. I remember going down, to where my mom was sitting, and she gave me a kiss in the cheek, and she said, I love you, son. I'm real proud of you. For the first time in my life, I'd accomplished something. And I remember on that day, a day that I should have been, having this celebration, all I could think about were how many people who are just like me, who didn't have my mom, who didn't meet Gus, who didn't have access to a treatment center or a detox, who couldn't get housing. And honestly, those are still issues that keep me awake at night. I was lucky. I'm not special. I'm not. I'm just not like all of this. This is just consistency over a period of time. But had I not had those initial things to plug into, I don't think I would have gotten traction. In fact, if I was to take me and my story and place it into the way things are today, I don't know. I don't know. But after graduating college, I went out into the business world, and my lived experience and transferable skill sets, my ability to communicate, my positive attitude, I started to do well in business. I left Ontario. I moved back out west at 5 years sober, and I got a job in sales, and that led to building a small company with a friend of mine, and we put our head down and worked really hard for about 6 years. And one day I was driving this big ostentatious vehicle to work. For me, the car was really important. It's not anymore. I drive an old Toyota now. I got over myself, but I was driving this fancy car to work one day. And you know how sometimes time moves and you forget how much ground you've covered? We beat ourselves up on what we don't accomplish, but I don't know if we're real good at giving ourselves a pat in the back for the stuff we have accomplished. Yeah. Anyways, I got to the office that day, and sitting on my desk was a copy of Canadian Business Magazine, and I was on the cover of it. In less than 12 years, I went from a kid pushing a shopping cart to having more success than I could have ever imagined. It's a good story. We could stop there, right? But here's the thing. I got all the things that they promise us in our Western culture that lead to happiness and success, and I wasn't any more fulfilled. I wasn't. I had, some accolades. I had some little bit of money, bought a house, got married, but inside it was empty. My daughter was born in 2003, and I decided to leave business. And so I sold my company and I decided to follow and do advocacy work. And so I started to speak in schools. I started to speak to government. I started to share board positions and go to places where they wanted to hear, from my experience, my lived experience, and something remarkable happened. A few years passed, and I started to work with this guy named Dr. Sean Richardson, who's a premier sports psychologist. And we were doing management consulting work with human resource organizations and working on culture and human performance and these kinds of things. And we were on a plane going into Calgary. And and I told Sean about a promise I made on a street corner. You see, in my darkest moment, on the day I sold my boots, the promise I made was that if I got a second chance, I would do something to pay it forward. And I had not shared that with any other person on earth. Nobody else knew that. And I was talking to Sean, and I said, Sean, I'd really love to do something to bring awareness to some of the big issues that face vulnerable people, vulnerable kids, to give them a fighting chance to transition safely into adulthood and become the possibility, just like, the opportunity I got. I said, I'd love to do something on a national scale, to inspire change, to empower people to think differently about some of these big social issues. And Sean said, well, what do you have in mind? I said, I don't know. I just would love to do something big on a national scale. And I remember Sean looked at me and he said, when Canadians want to raise money for things, they run across the country. He says, why don't you run across Canada, Joe? And I remember looking at him and I said, why don't you run across Canada? I'm kind of busy this week. Right. The last thing, see, probability, I couldn't see it. I didn't have any past experience. I wasn't really an athlete. So the idea of a 50-year-old man running across the country, I couldn't see it. Right. He says, now you have to understand something about Sean. Sean's a former Olympic athlete and a sports psychologist. So he understands how human beings can perform at high levels. He says, well, maybe you don't run. He says, what if you walk slowly across the country and you engaged community and you engaged partners, you engaged police and frontline support people and healthcare and government at all levels, and students and kids and youth and people affected. And he said, I said, okay. I said, if I was, that was the other thing. He said, I remember he said to me, he said, Joe, he says, you have a powerful story, and every time you share it, people are inspired. He said, what if you slowly walked across the country and told your story? I said, well, how would it be different than other campaigns, other walks, other runs? So there's lots of stuff out there. And he said, well, what if you pushed a shopping cart across Canada? The shopping cart is that unfortunate symbol of chronic homelessness that we see in North America. It's a throw to your story. And as far as I know, nobody's ever pushed a shopping cart across Canada. And I said, well, that's for obvious reasons there, Sean. But there was something about that grabbed my attention and it inspired me. And so the first problem we had was the shopping cart. I wasn't going to push a real shopping cart. I don't know about you, but every time I go to Lowe's or Kroger or wherever, I always get the shopping cart with the wheel that doesn't work very well. And so I wasn't going to push a real shopping. I pushed a real shopping cart. They're heavy, and in the wintertime, they're mean. It's difficult. And there's no way to walk across Canada without experiencing one Canadian winter. So we needed a lightweight cart. So we called the local baby buggy company in Calgary, and that's high-end baby buggies that they have. And we told them what we wanted to do, and they donated a couple baby buggies. We took it down to a metal fabricator and they welded the cart on. So now we had our first problem solved. We had a working cart, something that could actually act as that symbol. Now all we needed was 9,999 other problems solved. And I don't have time to go into the details of what all of these problems were. But suffice to say that working the model that I'm going to share with you here in a few minutes, we had immeasurable roadblocks to navigate. We had over 37 show-stopping roadblocks that we needed to remove in order for us to actually achieve that possibility and goal. And many of the roadblocks that we had were huge. We had to raise $1 million from scratch because we didn't want the donated money to actually pay for the campaign. We wanted the money to go and support vulnerable people. We needed to get the police on board so that we could be on those highways in the wintertime. We needed to get hundreds of schools to open their doors and allow us to come in and engage with youth. The list goes on. But we had to hold the possibility that we were going to achieve all of those things and continue to stay in action, connected to a greater sense of why, and keep our feet moving. So there was a ton of uncertainty. And there were a lot of days where it was discouraging, but we slowly, over a 2-year period, put the campaign together until finally I stood in Cape Spear, Newfoundland. And in front of me was a 5,625-mile journey that would take 17 months. Now I'm smiling in this picture, but I got to tell you, in between my ears was a bad neighborhood. I was terrified. 2 things: that nobody would care and my body wouldn't make it. This video captures what happened over the course of the next 17 months. And I'll share it with you.
This is for, every kid
Excellent.
in this country who feels different.
Thank you.
Gets stuck.
That wasn't me,
And
that
it's
was the
our
support team.
responsibility to reach out and help those children transition safely into adulthood.
Sometimes it's
Coming over the bridge, here we are, and there's Joe. Push for change.
Have courage to fight the people around you care. There's no wrong or right, just a love that we can share. Ain't no pain, how we've suffered along the way. Underneath our clothes, our souls remain unchanged. They're awesome. Take off your mask of fear and push for change. Throw off your coat down and embrace the rain. Everyone is unique, yet we're a part of the human race.
So when the campaign was over, I'd walked 11,375,000 steps, and I didn't lose 1 pound. Not one. There's no justice in social justice, I'll tell you that. But what was remarkable isn't that I walked 5,600 miles for 17 months across Canada. What was remarkable was the level of community engagement. We were able to bring together hundreds and hundreds of organizations and pair them with municipal, provincial, federal government. Yes, we raised a couple $1 million, but what we were really championing is policy. And so we got a chance to sit down with the federal government and have a seat at the table. And 2 months after the campaign was over, they'd announced a new budget. Now, this is 7 years or 8 years ago, but in that budget was $11.2 billion. And a lot of that had some of the things in there around youth protection, early detection, and getting folks the resources they need before and during challenges. So campaign was successful beyond anything that we could have ever imagined. But there were a lot of quiet days. I started in Atlantic Canada, so Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and then through Quebec. But it wasn't until I actually reached the Ontario border, which I was going from east to west, that we really began to gain some notoriety and attention. And I remember I'd been planning this thing for 3.5 years. And then 6 months walking from Atlantic Canada into Ontario. So 4 years of nurturing a possibility before I saw my first big group of people. So just think about that as you're thinking about your big possibilities and the things that you're working on. Sometimes you got to put in a lot of steps before you see the fruit of your labor. I remember coming over the bridge into Ontario, and there was this huge group. And as I walked down the bridge, I saw somebody who is famous in Canada waiting for me. It was the greatest hockey dad who ever existed, Walter Gretzky. And if you don't know who Walter is the dad of Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player. And Walter, when he was alive, he did a lot of things to support the community. And when he found out what I was doing, he wanted to come out and support us. And I remember feeling really blessed that this sort of Canadian celebrity would take time to come and support us in our work and our vision. And I remember walking with Walter and said, Walter, what one piece of advice would you give me as I'm about to walk into Northern Ontario in the winter time? And I remember Walter looked at me and he said, don't quit. And I was thinking, yeah, we had that in Halifax. I was hoping for something, something a little meatier than that. But then he said it. He said, remember the kids. Remember why you're doing this. And that was it. That was it for me. When we connect to the greater reasons why we're doing things, we find energy that's unavailable to us in common hours. But oftentimes in the world that we live in, sometimes it can feel like we live in a house with dirty windows. Our light doesn't get out and the light out there doesn't get in. And that was important advice that Walter gave me, because shortly after meeting Walter, I moved into Northern Ontario in the wintertime. And so to give you a bit of perspective, in the middle of winter, I was 1,000 miles north of Minnesota. Right? And so it got weird up there. I was above Lake Superior, walking across Lake Superior in January and February. It got strange, and then it got even stranger. I posted this on the social media, and I remember my mom phoned me. She said, you kids and your dangerous selfies. And I said, Mom, it's Photoshop. She says, I don't care what kind of bear it is. So we explained to her it was a doctored image, and we got her to stand down. When you tell a story like this, it's easy to pass over the hard parts, but there were a lot of hard parts. A lot of days where I was burnt out. A lot of days where I hadn't taken good enough care of myself. A lot of days where I didn't get good sleep and I didn't do nutrition well. And one of the things that I did learn from the campaign is that if you're going to play the long game, and the people helping business, you got to take care of yourself, you know. And we saw that big time during COVID. There's so much responsibility, so many people trying to do so much with so little, pivoting so much, we became dizzy, right? Front line as well as leadership. And the thing I understand today is that there needs to be that healthy balance to be able to go the long haul. This picture was taken just outside of Wawa. I was having a really rough day and I wanted to quit. I was burnt out. My body was tired. I'd been walking for over a year. And it was the middle of winter and I was just done. But I connected to that greater sense of why I was doing it, the thing Walter talking about. And I turned the corner and I remember I had this moment where I knew I was going to be all right. You know, I was standing at the Wawa Goose, which is it's a sort of an iconic roadside attraction in the middle of nowhere. And if you cross Canada, you kind of have to go past this. So, and I remember standing there thinking, whatever I was afraid of in Newfoundland, I left somewhere on the highway of action. And I knew in that moment I was going to make it. And I was going to be okay. And I feel that way today, even in the midst of all the chaos and all the challenges that we face. I find a sense of peace and serenity. And I was right. I slowly made it out of Ontario. I made it across the Western provinces. And on the final day at the end of September 2017, I walked into the downtown east side. And I remember going down through the old neighborhood. You see, the downtown east side is that neighborhood that I escaped from. It's that neighborhood I struggled in. It's that neighborhood, you know, where I had all of those challenges. It was a neighborhood that was, you know, had a lot of traumatic memories. And you know, back in the day, if you would have encountered me, I had a problem with shame. I couldn't look you in the eyes. You know, I would look at you and I would look down at my feet and I would look up. But I didn't have shame that day. My chin was up. And I remember walking past that park bench where I'd sat bootless and hopeless. I walked past that corner where I'd made that prayer and that promise. Yeah. And I remember feeling my feelings and feeling a sense of gratitude. Right. And I knew in my heart that I'd made good on that promise. And I turned the corner at Cambie. We went up and we had our very last event. And we finished our walk across Canada. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't thank and acknowledge somebody who worked as hard on this campaign as me, and that was Marie. Marie was that person sort of behind the scenes who was organizing everything. Marie took care of all of the emails, all of the engagement, the 454 events, every police liaison, every dollar that we raised. All of that went through Marie and an entire team that worked underneath her. Now, she wasn't in the spotlight. I was. I was the one on the news. I was the one on the road. Right. But the campaign wouldn't have happened without Marie. In many ways, Marie was the heart behind the cart. And so, you know, you probably put it together. Marie and I share our life together as a couple. And it is our collective vision and values that shine the light forward on the work that we want to do with the time that we have left. But Marie and I also share something else. That's because Marie and I share history. She's the same girl that I dated in grade 10. And after 28 years, we reconnected. That person who believed in me. And we found ourselves at very similar roads when we reconnected. And, you know, it started with an innocent coffee and it grew. And 2 months before the Push for Change shoved off, we made it official and got married. You'll never get me to see the world without seeing through the lens of possibility. Yeah. I think that the greatest tragedy of life isn't that it ends too soon. It's that we wait too long to begin it because of fear. Yeah. The question I got asked all the time from reporters is, Joe, how did you do it? You know, 50-year-old non-athlete walking across the second widest country on earth. How did you do it? By the way, the distance, I did this on a map. The distance that I walked was from Rochester to Santa Monica back to Rochester, with one Canadian winter thrown in there for character building. The way we did this is that we broke it down into a very, very simple formula. Now, I was fortunate. I got to work with a guy named Dr. Sean Richardson. I told you about him. He was a former Olympic athlete, but he's also a premier sports psychologist. And so he gave me an incredibly simple formula to work through. And I want to share that. I just kind of want to scratch the surface and introduce the ideas to you. I want to challenge you over the next 30 days to think about the possibility you're working on. And then I want to circle back with you. But the model that we worked through to achieve the unachievable was first anchoring the possibility, knowing exactly what it was that we wanted. From there, we worked through 3 components, and they were dynamic, right? So the first component was A, which was action. You can see that represents the A. The I is inspiration, or why, right? This is what motivates and drives behavior. And the third was the roadblocks. Understanding we're going to need to navigate both situational and psychological roadblocks. And I believe that we can do almost anything within the context of this very simple model. What I love about this is its simplicity on the other side of complexity. So let's bring this back to you and the question and the challenge that I've posed, the possibility that you're working on. Now you may have like 7 or 57. Pick one over the next 30 days. And I want you to apply the model. You're probably already doing some of these pieces anyways. This just gives you a framework to think through it. By the way, this is also incredibly powerful in a coaching model. If you're in a leadership position, it's to take and first identify, what is the possibility. Now, don't worry about writing all of this stuff down, because I'm going to give you a PDF and a set of worksheets to use. But the first step in using the AIR model process is to identify what it is that you want to achieve. Right? So get clear on what does that look like. For us, it was walking across Canada, making a difference for youth at risk, 450 events, 10 provinces, 2 territories, 5,625 miles. Okay, good. That's the possibility. The next piece that we moved into quickly was why. And that was the conversation I had with Walter Gretzky. It's like, what is the why? Then the why becomes really, really important, because you're going to get discouraged. You're going to run into challenges and roadblocks. And having that why to replug into becomes paramount into getting back into action when the thing flattens out. You see, when we take a look at right now, there's so many people at New Year's Eve, they create resolutions. Well, here's what happens with a resolution is you set a target, a possibility, a goal. Maybe it's a health goal. Right. And you say, okay, I'm gonna start jogging this year. I'm gonna get into shape, or I'm gonna eat better. And so off you go, and you get into action, and you start, right? You connect to a greater sense of why or purpose or reason why you would want that thing. But then you hit roadblocks. You hit the challenges, both internally and externally, that are gonna drop that action. This is predictable as a sunset or a sunrise, right? And so having a construct to be able to work through and understand sort of how that actually works gives us a better opportunity for success. So the first thing that I always look at, or I'm coaching, if I'm working with somebody, is what are your reasons for wanting to do this? Because I believe this is one of the biggest challenges with personal development and fitness and health industry. So we don't have the right reasons. And changing behavior becomes challenging, because there's 2 things that are going on. There's, we need to have internal reasons, and we need to have external reasons, right? So spend some time. You don't have to do this now. You can do this later, but identifying what are those internal reasons and what are those external reasons, right? The next thing I think is absolutely crucial and important is to understand what are the roadblocks, right? Because you're going to hit roadblocks. If you're a social justice warrior in today's world, especially with whatever's going to happen, over the next 4 years as political winds change, and all these different things that are pressing in. Right? What are the challenges that we're faced with? And I believe that those challenges get broken into 2 categories: the internal, the stories we tell ourselves, the limiting mindsets, right? and then the external challenges that we face. And so then what are some strategies for managing both the internal and external roadblocks? Then we take a look at what is the action plan. One of the best books that I read on getting into action and breaking down and moving towards goals is a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear. Right? Great read for, right? And so then we take a look at what are the actions that we need to apply to that possibility. And then we get started. And when we take, whether it's something small or something really huge, we put it into this very simple format of a stated goal, objective, and or possibility with, a stated result. And then on that possibility mindset, what are the reasons I'm doing this? What are the solutions, or how do we navigate the roadblocks, and what action do I have to take? And the last thing I'll say about the model is don't do it alone. Right? Because accountability helps us see our blind spots and helps us hold our feet to the fire when we get out of action, being able to reconnect into the inspiration and get our feet moving forward. I don't believe there's a person on this call who doesn't want change. All of us want change. We want change for ourselves. We want change for our family. We want change for our community. We want change for the city of Rochester. We want change for the state of New York. We want change for the country, for the entire planet. And I believe that we live in a really exciting time. We're in the not too distant future. We are going to look back at this and call it before, as each one of us wakes up to what Gus said on that park bench, that there's more to each and every one of us that we could see, and get up off that bench and begin to move forward. We really can affect and change the world around us, but not a minute before we change ourselves and the way we think. And the reason I believe that is the first time I had that idea, I was sitting on a piece of cardboard in front of the Thurlow liquor store, asking people walking by for change. I want to leave you with one last story. When I was in Newfoundland, a reporter asked me what the push for change meant to me. And earlier that week, I was walking through a very desolate part of Newfoundland on the island in a national park where there's nothing. There's no structures, there's no roads. It's just, you're really in the middle of one of the most remote places in North America. And I looked down as I was walking through this very remote part of the park. And in the pouring rain, in this high wind, I looked down and I happened to see a penny. And it was the one right there on the left. And that penny had absolutely no earthly business being where I found it. And I remember thinking to myself, what does this mean? It means something. What does this mean? What does this mean? And I picked it up, and I remember picking the dirt off the penny, and I tapped it on the side of my cart. And then all of a sudden, this metaphor hit my mind and my heart. You see, I found this penny in the street. This penny had traveled a harder road. This penny had seen things and experienced things other pennies hadn't. This penny had spent a couple of nights out in the weather. What occurred to me as I held that penny in my hand is, even though it doesn't look as pretty and shiny as the day it was minted, or pretty and shiny like the other pennies, by the very nature, what it is, it can never ever lose its value. And neither can a human being. And I put that penny in my pocket, and I was determined to give that to somebody who I knew would share that idea. And when I got to Vancouver, I gave it to Steve Morrison, the president of the United Association of Canada, and he gave me a check for $1 million to continue to fund the work that we're doing with youth in schools. Good trade. I want to leave you with a poem that was inspired by my friend Gus many years ago. And then I've got a couple of wrap-up things, and then we'll open it up for questions. This poem was inspired by Gus. It's called "There's More to You Than You Can See." He picked up a can and continued his walk, this man I saw today. With dirty hair and layered old clothes, he reeked of dreams decayed. With broken tooth and crackled smile, he mumbled for some change. I passed him by, this man I saw picking through garbage today. You know, a wrong turn here and a bad choice there can leave the best of pain, such as the fate of some, I guess, to live that life and saying the junkie bum, the wino scum. I have no time today. I'm off to live my life divine. I passed this man today. So off I walked beyond the block and waited for the light. Beside me was a hair salon with mirrors shining bright. I looked at the man in the three-piece suit staring back at me that night, for it was me looking nothing like that man I used to fight. For back those blocks left years behind before I found the key, I realized the man I saw was nothing more than me. Behind me is a broken man, a man you see now free. Life is grand when you understand. There's more to you. There's more to you. There's more to you than what you see. On July 26, 1991, I began a journey desperately searching for the better part of me, and I found it. Thanks to the better part of you. Everything that I have over the last 32 years is a direct result of people reaching out and holding a space for me and giving me an opportunity to move forward. And I can't let you move forward in the conference without understanding and knowing that. Each one of us impacts so many, and we forget the impact that we have on people's lives. And so on behalf of my family and the tens of thousands of individuals and families that you've already impacted and will impact, I want to thank you, and I want to acknowledge you, and I want to encourage you. The last thing I want to say is this: everything I just shared with you once only existed in the opaque recesses of my imagination. So how good is your imagination? Where do you want to be a year from now? Where do you want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And whatever big possibilities you're wrestling with, even though you may be on the wrong side of a whole pile of work, I want to tell you that's absolutely possible. And I believe that with every fiber of my being, not because I read it in a book or I went to a seminar. I believe it because I used to be that guy out there pushing a shopping cart. And today I'm not. I'm with you on this call. If a guy like me can do it, anybody can. So thank you. Before I move into some questions, I want to offer you an opportunity to be able to connect with me. For those of you who may be on LinkedIn, I want to encourage you to come and connect. LinkedIn is a place where I'm constantly putting out valuable content, inspiration and application. If you want to follow or connect. The other thing is, if you ever have a question and you'd like to connect with me, and we are connected on LinkedIn, send me a DM. I'd be more than happy to support the work you're doing, or field a question that you may not want to ask, let's say on a call today. Second thing is, we're going to have a follow-up session. So I gave you a quick overview of the AIR model, but we're going to send you the PDF of the long worksheets and a little bit more explanation. And we're going to schedule a follow-up session in a few weeks from now. I think 4 weeks is the target, but we'll see how that plays out. Please give the model a look, put some application to it, and then come back and share with me what worked, what challenged you, because I know that if you take and apply some of these very simple, easy to apply tools, you know, it will help you in a big way achieve some of the things that you may be wrestling with in 2025 and beyond. And the last thing I want to give you is, I want everybody on the call to have electronic access to the book that's over my shoulder here. The book is horribly inspiring. It has a lot more detail to the story I just shared with you, but it also got some really great leadership stuff and a deeper explanation of the application of the AIR model. So with that, I want to now toss things back to the folks who are taking care of me on this call, and field any questions that y'all might have.
Thank you very, very, very much, Joe. We're gonna give folks some time to put their questions in using the Q&A function, so that, and we will get to as many of them as we can. But again, just Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, Joe, you speak all over the US and Canada. And for us, again, ABC, our function, our focus, our is on Monroe County, Monroe and Ontario counties with, our major population area being the city of Rochester. And as a community action agency, as Denise mentioned, we are tackling locally one of the most difficult things that this country has worked and has worked on. And people would say to us, well, hey, Jerome, or anybody working community action, how is that war on poverty going? It's a huge, huge challenge, but I think one worthy of our work. So with respect to possibility, right? And the model, action plus inspiration, minus the roadblocks. Can you talk to just what do you think with respect to a war on poverty that can help all of us who are working on this just really, 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 really difficult, not only challenging here in Monroe County, but across the country, across the world, actually. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the first thing is to acknowledge how daunting it is. And why that it's important, I think, to acknowledge that is that the very first place the human brain goes to when we look at things that are daunting is probability. So before you've taken one step out the door, you're already kind of locked into seeing, well, this is the way it is, and that's the way it's always been, and that's likely how it's going to go. And without access to the possibility piece, it's impossible for our brains to get into that front prefrontal cortex where the solutions may reside. I don't want to suggest that there's some sort of magic wand to wave, and I struggle with the exact same things everyone on this call struggles with. I walked across the second widest country on earth to try and make a difference on youth homelessness, and the issue is worse today than it was when we started. So how do you remain positive? How do you, right? But if you look at how possibility works, oftentimes possibility works in the face of impossibility. The Wright brothers were told that we can't fly. And they chose to say, okay, thanks. And we acknowledge that, but we're going to keep trying. And so that's one piece of it. The second piece is to do it in cohorts, because individually, if it was just me trying to do something, my motivation and inspiration is going to wane. Having a cohort or a group or a check-in becomes really important, because now you've got accountability on the action. You've got accountability on the mindset. The other thing is that action will often clear the emotional climate that probability creates when you look at something daunting. And then I think that the other is sufficient for the day is its own battles. I think that for me, I'm always a big picture guy. I'm an entrepreneur I'm a serial entrepreneur. So it's really easy for me to sort of, pick a fight with these things that take 10 years to build or 5 years to build and get discouraged when we underestimate what we can do. We overestimate what we can do, let's say in a month or a year, but underestimate what we can do in 5. Yeah.
So with the challenge or the call to action or the activity that again Joe has told us, we're going to share the model, And again, I made some notes. Think about a possibility that you're working on either personally or professionally. And we're literally, again, I love the name of our organization. The first word is action. So we're going to give, we're going to hope people have a takeaway from this, not only, this keynote, but every single one of the panel discussions that's going to come up. We're going to, try to have some action-oriented activities for people to do, and then we can check in with each other. So Joe, in terms of, what we're asking folks to do now, either again, personally or professionally, and with respect to possibility, there, I'm sure the things are going to be as diverse as the people we have on the call. And they could be as small as, okay, I'm going to clean up my office, or I'm going to purchase a home, or anything in between. Can you give a little bit more guidance, again, with the personal, professional, with respect to how big a chunk do we want people to bite off, especially if we're going to come back in 4 to 6 weeks here, probably, but before the end of February, to do a check-in with folks.
I think I'm going to leave that self-directed,
Okay.
because there may be some on the call who are a little bit more aspirational, and there may be some who say, I'm overwhelmed. In fact, somebody on a personal might say, on a personal goal might be well-being. Okay, what does that mean? Boundaries, answering emails after 6, going to get better sleep, going to spend a little bit more quality time with my kids. Okay, so that you may have a well-being goal. During COVID, we were doing all kinds of stuff on energy health management and teaching people, how do we balance ourselves for the long haul. But I don't want to limit it, because there may be somebody, on the call who's like, no, I want to go after this really big sort of push for change-esque type of audacious goal. Go for it. The key, I think, that whether it's big, small, or medium, is the key is Kaizen. It's small trickle. It's like the push for change wasn't a giant leap, and no innovation often fails, but small incremental improvement is often how you create great distance between where you are and where you want to be. The walk across Canada was 11,375,000 steps, right? It's like, you don't get 32 years sober, or you walk across Canada province at a time, or a month at a time, a year at a time. It's a step at a time, right? And so the possibility that I'm encouraging people to lock into can be as big or as small as you want. But remember, we've got 30 days to get into this. And the reason why I want a 30-day check-in is that whatever bumps or bruises you're going to get, you're going to feel in the first couple of weeks. And checking in 30 days from now will give us an opportunity to say, okay, what did you take on? What was your greatest win and loss when it comes to action? Your greatest win or loss when it comes to tapping into a purpose or a why? What was your greatest win or loss when you looked at prospective roadblocks? And that'll give us, instead of me talking about it and talking about theory and talking about the push for change, in my experience, I want participants to give it a go, because then they'll actually see how it can work for themselves. So I don't know if that gave any clarity to the direction, but
well, it brings up another question about the organizational type change and the systemic level change that so many of us are working on. Because you mentioned that it could be something personal that someone wants to work on, or it could be something in a group. And that group doesn't necessarily have to be a work group, but let's talk about work. And again, there are a lot of our human service partners on the call in New York State, but particularly here in Rochester. Whether it's a sort of external working group across organizations or inside organizations like an Action for a Better Community, what is your guidance there on the sort of the organizational side of the exercise?
Yeah. So there's a bit of a step that I talked about in the keynote, but didn't bring into the model, and that's getting clarity on the possibility piece. So when you're working in a group or cohort, let me give you an example. I just worked with WorkSafe BC. So this is like the workman's compensation for British Columbia. And they've all been mandated by the provincial government back to work, which they've been working remotely for 4 years or 3 years. A very, very unpopular thing. And the people that I was speaking to, I had 200 managers in the room. So we said, okay, let's workshop that because it's the elephant in the room. So we put folks into groups and got them to sort of work through possibility mindset and sort of spitballing what that looks like. Then began to frame up what is the action steps, what are the greater reasons why we want to do this to motivate us to move forward, and what are the potential situational and psychological roadblocks. But there has to be, when it's not individual, when it's a cohort or group, there needs to be sort of consensus building. And that happens in that possibility session, if that makes any sense. Right. And we've actually done this. Sean and I have actually taught this in like a consulting management workshop where, we've had, let's say, 100 managers from a paint company. Okay, put them all into different groups. You guys pick a challenge, spitball it or brainstorm it, if you will, and then frame it up. And then you leave people with sort of, here's my possibility, here's our mindset, here's our why, here's our next action steps, and here's the roadblocks. When we work through it like that, yeah, it can give us a little bit more clarity. Now, you're not going to nail it all in that first couple of sessions, but it's going to give you a starting point. Like when we were doing the push for change in the beginning, we thought we were going here, and then we ended up going this way, and then that way, and then that way, and then that way. But having the framework to be able to make those adjustments as you go is powerful.
Great. So there's a question here, Joe, perfect timing because you just mentioned a push. Question says, would you do another walk for change? Why or why not? And before you answer that question I had, because you said you didn't lose a pound
No.
in that walk. How come? How come? But again, the question from the chat, would you consider another walk for change? Why or why not?
Well, I'll quickly answer your question on why not, is that the push for change was a horrible, horrible example of how to take care of yourself when you're doing something big and hard. The thing with people and passion is that oftentimes we put ourselves last. Right? The whatever it is that's in front of us, whether it's the client or the mission, and we saw that during COVID, where so many people were leaning into it to the point where they were putting themselves over the line. I didn't eat right. I didn't rest right. I didn't recover right. I didn't have good boundaries. Right. So the question on whether I would do it again, it's funny, the United Association of America said to me, hey, we'll fund you if you want to do one across the states. It was extraordinary, but it was a chapter. And I'm doing better work now in advocacy, speaking to conferences and groups in this facet than I am running the foundation. The foundation now has a thing that it does, and it's got a bunch of programs, and we've got it into the schools. But I'm 57 now, actually just turned 58. So I don't know if I'd really, it would be Forrest Gump fun, but I don't know how much it would further the mission. I think that we're doing really, really potent work right now. The thing is, we got a couple things wrong too in the walk. The arc of the story sounds like isn't that wonderful, but there was some, there was some broken pieces to it that didn't work. So I don't know how keen I would be. I'm still very, very athletic, but I don't know if I want to do America.
Next question is about young people.
Mhm.
And for me, young is anybody younger than 60. But for our young people, let's say 40s and unders, which we know we have good representation on the call. what would be your advice to young people, not only on just the challenge, but in general, with respect to possibility?
I think that it's really easy. Okay, I think possibility is something you have to guard, because there's elements to possibility that are, in essence, like faith. And because we have a natural, it's so easy to see the world through a tarnished lens or through probability, because 95% of the time you're right. So, I have a 21-year-old daughter, and she's in university and she's in social studies, so she'll probably be a social worker, and she maybe even be a psychologist, but she'll share with me her perspective from her vantage point, and I get it. I totally understand, and I get it. It's so easy to be it's difficult to guard that possibility. I think that there are some things that I coach her on, and that's, guard what, if you are vulnerable and you don't lean you don't lean towards optimism, guard what you ingest. So some of my instruction to her is watch how much time you're spending and where you're spending it. Social media is a robber of possibility. For me, I filter the news. I want to know what's going on in the world, but I don't want to doom scroll. There's only two things on TV: fear and outrage. And it doesn't matter if you're watching the blue channel or the red channel. It's the same stuff. And that's the kind of stuff that when we get triggered, we go into probability really quick. And improbability can be, this is why I see an uptick in stuff like mental health and a general outlook at the world, right? So you're an outlier if you're a possibility thinker. You truly are. And I'm not talking, the other thing I want to say is I'm not talking about toxic positivity or turn that frown upside down. In fact, it takes enormous amount of courage and leadership to stand at the precipice of negative information and say, yes, but we're going to move this way irregardless. Because it's like that old Apple ad. It's like it's the crazy ones. It's the thinkers outside the box that are ultimately going to shift and change the world. The Margaret Mead quote. It's a collection of small people who are ultimately, the most. I just butchered that quote, but you get the idea. I think that, yeah, and I think that it's also guarding who and where we get our inspiration and leadership from. At a very early stage in my recovery, I made it paramount who I was going to spend time around, because there was a lot of folks around me that it's really easy to, again, get possibility sort of pickpocketed from you. But if you practice the ideas and the philosophy and put it to action, what happens is over time, you build a foundation where you start to see the world differently. You see yourself differently. Your mindset shift, and you can achieve some of these things that you're moving towards. The work will never be done, but that doesn't stop us from moving the ball down the field and accomplishing and creating a difference in the lives of people. Sorry, that was a long response.
But it understood. So we have another question, and this question, I think, is one of those essential questions. And we opened up the conference in part with doing land acknowledgement with respect to Native people who are, again, the original inhabitants of this land, and the libation statement, very much given honor and respect to largely people of African descent who paid the ultimate price in growing this country. So the aspect of, again, back to the model, the roadblocks, the A plus the I, the action plus the inspiration minus the roadblocks. And there's a reality that things are not equal. There's a reality that we deal with it, particularly with so many things, but certainly in this fight against poverty and the quest for justice. How would you address that? You know, as a Caucasian male, certainly you have some privilege. As a Black man, I have some privilege as being a CEO. With respect to, again, possibility and what we're trying to do, and those real life obstacles that folks have to deal with, such as entrenched racism, how, you know, can we inspire people to keep going, irrespective of, again, those R's, you know, but the harsh reality that those things are real?
Yeah. I think, honestly, Jerome, I approach that stuff very cautiously because it's a blind spot. I think it's arrogant for someone in a position like me where I don't understand or experience that. Yeah, I experience access issues and stuff, but if I was running a company, I would want those individuals at the table, and I want to hear their voice and I want to listen. We do a lot of work in Canada with Indigenous groups, and one of the guys I had an opportunity to meet was the Honorable Murray Sinclair, who actually authored the Truth and Reconciliation between Indigenous peoples in Canada and the government of Canada. He recently just passed away. But listening and understanding that I don't understand it and I never will. You hit it. I'm white. I'm male. I don't understand those issues. So I think it's crucial to if I want to have an impact, and let's say I was working on something in the city of Rochester, I need to have thought leaders who understand that stuff around to help educate. And I need to learn to listen and be quiet on some of those things, because I don't have that perspective and lived experience, nor do I have experience being someone of LGBT community. I don't have the experience from a young person's perspective. So yeah, I think I mean, the work that we've done up here, that's how I've approached it, is that I don't know, and I want to understand better. And so, yeah.
If I'm paraphrasing, correct me if I err, in terms of doing that work, is consulting with the people who do have that lived experience with respect to designing any sort of solutions that are going to impact the very people.
Yeah, exactly. It's a blind spot for me, and so early in my career, in my business life, I would forge ahead thinking, oh yeah, I understand this. I read this. I understand this. And then you get into situations and you realize you don't have a clue. When I decided to do the push for change, I didn't have a clue, and I needed to, because I'm a person with lived experience with this very, very isolated. When we talk about, let's say, the unhoused, right? There's 170 different reasons or antecedents that actually create that. It's not one thing. We label it as one thing because it's easy to do, and it's that. But it's not. There's so many different antecedents and root causes as to why somebody would be in that situation. My story is just a tiny, tiny sliver of that. So when we got into building sort of what we were asking of the government in Canada, we surrounded ourselves with Indigenous leaders. We surrounded ourselves with, folks from the York University, the researchers, the folks that were running shelters, and so the academic. So we had a broad range of people who were speaking into what it was we were doing, so that when we were asking the government for it, it aligned with, what the greater community wanted, not what Joe thought. So yes, absolutely, you have to have those folks at the table and their experience, because they're going to teach you the things that you can't see or couldn't fathom or understand, because that's not your experience. But I think that's with everything.
So,
But yeah.
And a follow-up to that, and this question is in the from one of the participants, and I'll paraphrase their question. Hopefully, I do it justice. You are someone, Joe, that I characterize. You do motivational speaking, you do change management, and some of the most difficult things, we're faced with respect to, certainly in our work, is working on behalf of people who have been marginalized. Um, the systemic nature of that has what some would call the sort of a parasitic relationship, where there's a hierarchy of human beings. A huge part of our work is changing the mindset of people, right? Both the people who are inflicting harm and the people who are receiving harm. Your work involves changing people's mindsets, right? Can you talk about changing that sort of parasitic relationship? Because if someone believes and lives that, and it furthers their purpose, what can you say, or what would you advise we say to that? Say, no, the way you're living is harmful to other people, right? How can we work on that relationship and that thought process for those who have that thought process?
Yeah. You're talking about stuff that's so baked deep into culture. I'm not sure my response will do it any justice. But how we approached it in the push is that we were dealing with a lot of people who did not understand youth homelessness or homelessness in general. And so we did a really, really, really good job of creating narrative and story to get people to better understand. The other thing is the shared lived experience. I think it was super important. But honestly, if we were to measure how well did we do on that metric, if there was a KPI to measure that, I don't know how much difference we made. And we did an 18-month walk across a nation that we engaged like 1 million people. So I honestly, I don't know, because that is such a behemoth to wrestle, because you're talking about how, people see people and how people unconsciously interact. Malcolm Gladwell talks about the unconscious bias that, yeah, it's so what we tried to do is we tried to take these people over here and say, look, what you're seeing here is this, not this. And we succeeded many, many times. Like, we had an enormous support from law enforcement. Law enforcement doesn't traditionally support homeless campaigns, but we sold it to them in the way that it was like, this is about youth mental health and support, something that you're interested in. We're talking about deterrence. We're talking about early detection, right? So we got them on board so that we were seeing the issue the same way. And we actually changed the internal culture of the Ontario Provincial Police. To this day, 4 commissioners later, they're still actively involved in the youth homelessness and youth mental health space, and they weren't prior to that. And that had to do with us tinkering with some of those things that you talk about. It's not an overnight, it's not an easy, and it may not even happen in our life. It's not to say that it's not worthy to go after, but how we did it is we story told and used and leveraged lived experience to show the disparity and show that what you're looking at isn't really what you're looking at, and here's how you can respond better.
Well, thank you, Joe. We're going to look to wrap it up now, and just thank you for sharing time and space with us. As mentioned, we will send the possibilities document out to everyone who is here. Joe, thank you for getting up early, because you're in Vancouver, right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you for getting up early, and we looked at follow-up, and we'll set a date for the reconvene and check-in, and we'll be right back here.